Is Donald Trump an economic genius? Welcome to Philosophy All Along. I'm a professional philosopher and I try to use the tools of philosophy to help me understand difficult questions. Now, the reason why this is a difficult question is because Trump has a series of policies that sometimes seem to conflict, and a lot of economists warn these could be bad for the economy. So, what is actually going on here? And can the actions that he's been taking be understood as some sort of genius economically? So let's go ahead and look at these policies, see what they've done in the past, and we can figure out what the real kind of intention behind, what the purpose is behind Trump's economic policies. And I'm going to tell you right now, they're pretty worrying. So, number one, immigration. Number two, tariffs. Now, these two things combined seem to be very concerning for the economy. But let's look at them just briefly, a little bit more deeply. In terms of immigration, he's looking at deporting a whole lot of immigrants, making it harder for immigrants to come in, but also deporting a whole lot. Now, as you already know, one of the major lobbyists against immigration reform has always been kind of big business, because immigrants provide super cheap labor. So he's talking about kicking all of those people out. And then the argument being, okay, well, that's going to be a position where a whole bunch of Americans can then do that job instead. Okay, great. Now, the problem is what we found is research does not support the idea that when you engage in mass deportations, that A, increases economic growth, and B, actually increases employment amongst citizens. For the reasons why it doesn't encourage economic growth is fairly obvious, right? If you get rid of a whole bunch of cheap labor, well, now you have a problem where companies are potentially making cutbacks and they're not being able to produce things as cheaply, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to kind of be obvious. And you may not be particularly concerned about that. You might be like, yeah, but those are going to be jobs that are open for Americans. Okay, but it actually doesn't work out like that for a fairly obvious reason. One, the kind of lessening of the economic impact, but also when you remove people, and when you have fewer people coming in, you simply have fewer people who need to go buy things, right? Whether or not you like those immigrants or not, they need to do things like eat and pay for shelter, right? And they might, if they have enough money, buy some goods and services. So all of those purchases simply disappear. So what we actually found during the 1880s with the Chinese Exclusion Act, where they were trying to mass deport Chinese people, was it actually reduced employment in the areas where Chinese people were being deported, because all of a sudden the stuff that they were buying, well, was no longer needed to be sold. And so you had people laying off citizen workers. Okay, so there's that. That's interesting. Let's put that aside. Let's look at the other thing that he wants to do, tariffs, right? He's a big tariff guy. He's talked about how it's like one of his favorite words. And you already know how tariffs work, so we don't really have to go into it deeply. But the basic idea is you put a tax on goods that come in from other countries, and then someone has to pay that tax, right, if that good is going to be purchased and so on and so forth. So usually that payment of that tax ends up getting deferred to the price of the good, right? For, again, obvious reasons. The company itself doesn't want to have to pay the tax. They're not like, well, we're going to go ahead and eat that tax, right? They don't want to do that. But also shareholders don't want it. They don't want it to impact how much money they're making off of a thing. So usually what you do is you try to subtly okay, we're just going to distribute the cost of that. We can kind of make some other cuts somewhere else in our company. We reduce employment a little bit. We lay a few people off. We cut some benefits, and it kind of equals out. Because the one thing the shareholders never want to see is that they're making, in fact, less money because of something. So what we find is that tariffs generally do not create a whole lot of economic boom, right? They don't suddenly cause companies to be making a whole lot more money. And if they're not making more money, if they're not increasing demand, in other words, then they don't have a reason to hire more people, right? They don't have a reason to increase wages to try and bring more people in. So we don't really just have a whole lot of evidence to suggest that tariffs create economic boom. So what's going on here? What do tariffs do? Well, one of the things that Trump is saying that tariffs are going to do is they're going to place us in a position where companies, they don't want to pay those tariffs, so they're going to have the good made here in the United States, thusly increasing jobs. So, for instance, something like lumber. Well, if we tariff lumber, well, then we have all the more reason to simply cut down the trees here and produce the lumber here, thusly increasing the number of lumberjacks, right? Well, what we have found is that the problem is a lot of those kinds of things, like the things that we've been importing from other places, are deeply involved with jobs Americans generally don't want to do. Those jobs are unpleasant, they're low paying, they're hard on the body, or they're done in such a way that it's really, really bad for people. Take like Foxconn over in China, right? Where basically those people who were working were on a campus where they're working 7 days a week, like 18 hours a day. They never get to leave. All they ever do is like put together like our cell phones. And it got so bad that they were suicidal and throwing themselves out of the building, trying to kill themselves because they hated working there so much. But it made it all cheaper. So it's not just a matter of like, oh, is it necessarily a matter of mining coal or doing a really physically difficult job? It's also a matter of a lot of times they like to outsource at other places because those other places have worse labor laws. So the only way to make that work here in the US would be to loosen labor laws, right? And so now I think you're starting to see where this is all going. So who was it? When was the last time that we had kind of like this mass tariff thing going on? Well, it was McKinley, someone who Trump is a big fan of. In fact, he's just renamed a mountain after McKinley. Now, McKinley had a bunch of tariffs as a representative in Congress, and then he changed it a little bit when he was president, but there was still kind of a similar gesture. And what does this all add up to? So one, we're talking about removing a bunch of cheap labor in the United States. And then two, we're talking about trying to place ourselves in a position in the United States where we now have a demand for jobs that are labor jobs, but are incredibly low paying and incredibly difficult to do. And we've just kicked out the people who would usually be willing to do that. Now, why would we do any of this? We have low employment here in the United States, so what's the plan? Well, if you look at the time when they had these tariffs last time, right, with McKinley, interestingly enough, that was also a time in which there was not a whole lot of economic boom for the middle and the lower classes. But it was very beneficial economically for the very, very, very wealthy, right? That was the time, as I'm sure you've already heard, of the robber barons. In fact, it was called the Gilded Age. Now, that term was coined by Mark Twain because being gilded in this way means it's overlain with gold, but there's a whole bunch of corruption underneath. It was not a good thing to call it the Gilded Age. It just meant, okay, we have gold up top, but then there's all of these problems underneath. So the long and short of it is what you will notice is that the economic policies that Donald Trump has enacted follow, and very, very closely, the blueprint that was followed in the 1880s to produce the Gilded Age. But who did the Gilded Age benefit? When you have this demand for incredibly low paying and incredibly difficult jobs, that we apparently are trying to place ourselves in a position that the only people who will be able to do those jobs would be citizens of the United States, but we already have low unemployment. So what does that produce? Well, that produces a circumstance where you have to loosen labor laws significantly. You start doing things like reducing laws that prohibit children from working. You start doing things like bumping up the age of retirement so that senior citizens have to work, right? In other words, you create a circumstance in which you start pushing the labor down into a lower echelon of society as you bring your wealth up, because what's going to happen here? Well, you have now a circumstance in which you need a labor force that is less well educated, right? Because you don't want them to be thinking about how they could be doing a different job. You don't want them to have access to a different job, right? A more desperate labor force where they're in a position of, if they're going to be able to eat or if they're going to be able to have things like healthcare, they have to take these jobs. There's no other option for them. It's either do this or die. And these are all gestures that you see Trump moving towards when it comes to things like his push to getting rid of the ACA, pushes to privatize things like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Like, they want to privatize it. They want to privatize education. Those are all ways where a company can go in and do something that used to be paid for by everybody, and they can make it more expensive and make money off of it. So what's going to happen? So what you're going to see is prices are going to go up, but you're not going to see pay rates go up. What you're going to see instead is demand for low-paying jobs is going to increase. So what do you do when you're an economy that now has this need, this demand for a whole bunch of low-paying jobs, and you've just gotten rid of all of the people who are usually willing to do those jobs? Well, you have to create a desperate workforce. So you do things like increase the retirement age. So now you have a whole bunch of senior citizens who, if they want to eat, have to be willing to do jobs like that. But the other thing that you do, and we've already see if you add simply just the policies together, what you do is you cut social services, right? You loosen the labor laws, you make it a circumstance where you can have children working, stuff like that. But you also do things like make insurance more expensive, right? You make things more expensive that normally we would have been paying for together. So by making those things like healthcare harder to access, now people will be willing to do jobs that they normally wouldn't be willing to do just to be able to have their basic necessities like healthcare met. So what you will see, and what we've seen in the past, is what this actually does with these tariffs and attacks on immigrants. All of these things done in the 1880s is they actually increase the price of things, right? Well, you especially make sure to increase the prices on things that people have to have. Food, right? Healthcare, stuff like that. You increase those prices. Therefore, people are willing to work even longer hours. They're willing to work even worse jobs. They're willing to work these things even longer into their lives, or have their children work them even earlier, right? Again, just to be able to have the most basic of necessities. This changes nothing, however, for the very wealthy, right? These various costs have all been deferred to the middle class and to the poor, who are to make up the difference of the cheap labor being gone and the increase in costs for companies to be able to access the materials and the labor. Well, by increasing the cost and by making it such that you have labor that is desperate, what you have is no change for the wealthy whatsoever, right? All of the costs have been deferred down. So they're still making a ton of money, but now you have between them, the very wealthy, and their employees, even greater distance. And that is the goal. Well, think about it. Right now, on occasion, American workers can still be something of a threat to the most powerful people in our country, to the wealthiest people, right? We can impact our companies, right? Right now, people have been engaging in boycotts. Those boycotts, in theory, are intended to kind of shift which way the company is going and how the company is doing their business. But if you follow the economic strategy that Trump has laid out, one, you create demand for a bunch of low-paying jobs here in the United States. Two, you get rid of the people who would normally do those jobs. Three, you get rid of protections, the ability to unionize, the kinds of things that prevent American workers from having to do those jobs in the worst possible conditions. And what you end up with is what I would call an oligarchical communism. An oligarchy being you have these very, very, very wealthy people. It's just a few of them that have the power and the control of the country. And a communism is normally a situation such in which everyone is kind of paying together into the same thing, so everyone gets the same distributed amount of goods. An oligarchical communism would be one in which the entirety of society is paying just so that that small group of people can have everything they want. And so what happens here in this kind of structure is you create a society in which those kinds of boycotts, right? Things like strikes, labor strikes, demand for better wages, employees being able to go to other jobs, all of those things become impossible. The stratification between the employees and the employers becomes so high that the employees are so desperate for work that they can't ever think about, oh, okay, let me take a day off. Their need for the things that they have becomes so high that they can't ever take the risk of doing something like boycotting or upsetting that company or the company for which they work. So, and you have this kind of a perfect circumstance. And who does that benefit? Well, look at all the people that are in President Trump's corner about his economy. It's people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Jamie Dimon. All of these people are billionaires who stand to gain tremendous wealth and power from this particular strategy. So it is not Donald Trump just kind of making a bunch of incohesive, nonsensical, potentially economically detrimental tariffs. And so, no, this is all intended to create a new Gilded Age, but one that he is hoping will last. And the wealthy are buying into it, right? They are investing in this idea that they can help create a society in which the rest of us can never move up and never threaten their power base again. So, if you found this interesting, please like, please subscribe. If you agree or have another thought, please add a comment. If you disagree, please add a comment. Let me know what I've missed. All right, and with that, I hope you have a great day.